Bruce's story in Zack Snyder's Justice League is more than a superhero story. It's a profound reflection of real mental health struggles many people face. In this video, I'm gonna analyze Batman's arc in the DCU and tell you what you can learn from him to improve your own life and your own mental health. For this, we have to start in Batman v Superman because in this movie, he starts out quite cynical. And what's crucial about it is that his cynicism isn't just typical negativity, it's rooted in a psychological phenomenon called depressive realism. We will dive into what this means in a bit, but first let's dive into his mindset regarding his hunt for Superman. Because one of his reasonings for it is that he feels like his life's work is meaningless, as criminals just return anyway.
20 years of fighting criminals amounts to nothing.
Criminals are like weeds, Alfred. Pull one up, another grows in its place.
Bruce's despair isn't just about seeing the world negatively or being depressed because Jason died. He actually has very rational reasons why things don't really matter for him anymore. Because if the things he does have no effect, why try again? Why hope when Gotham is full of good willing efforts which just turns to crap?
20 years in Gotham, Alfred. We've seen what promises are worth. How many good guys are left? How many stayed that way?
And this is something that we can feel as well, because there's a stigma that when you're depressed, you just see everything as negative, you just have a sad lens about the world. But there can be actually very rational reasons why one can feel depressed about the world. They say enjoy the little things, but if the enjoyment of taking a shower only lasts 5 minutes and then the sadness comes back in, I think you can understand that people might not always feel the point of that. This is how Bruce thinks as well, because he's intelligent in his reasoning to kill Superman. He's very aware of the fact that all the good intentions he had for Gotham were meaningless as no one stayed good. And if we look at the real world, there's a very interesting parallel to this. This is where depressive realism comes in. Depressive realism is the theory that people who are depressed actually have a more accurate view of the world than people who are not depressed. This is in line with the real life examples that I just mentioned, because those people are aware that the good things in their life don't stay good or turn out bad, or that there's so much bad things happening in the world. However, this rationality that we're talking about is not actually always intelligent. In fact, a lot of times it can be a distorted view of the world. Look at Bruce, for example. He thinks that if there's only 1% that someone might turn bad, that gives him the right to kill someone who is just there to do good. And this so-called intelligent and aware thinking that he's preaching about is literally just fueled by his trauma, because the only reason Superman triggered him is because a child was helpless like he was. Another example of this that is also a parallel to something in real life is the scene I talked about earlier. When Bruce talks about how killing Superman would be the only thing that would ever matter, Alfred corrected him on how fighting criminals also amounts to something. Psychology calls this a cognitive distortion. I've talked about this on this channel before, but with the cognitive distortion, you see the world in a negative and inaccurate way. The specific one that is being used here is called disqualifying the positive. This is, for example, where you get a good grade for a test and you say, it's not completely my doing because the test was easy. Or you did something good for a friend and they say, hey, and I really appreciate this, you're a good friend, and you say, they just say that because they're nice. So back to Bruce's situation, just because there are criminals that rise again, doesn't mean that all of his work is worthless. He could have saved families from getting killed, for example. So, how does Bruce change his thinking and what's the solution for this problem? He obviously got inspired by Superman's sacrifice, but in Zack Snyder's Justice League you can actually see him changing into being more dumb. For example, he wants to resurrect Superman even though there are a million chances of it going wrong. Counter this to his chance calculation of where he tried to kill Superman. He actually is a lot more naive here, but it's sort of better. He is hopeful. This gets beautifully exemplified in the scene where Alfred asks what makes Bruce so sure Superman will be there.
He'll be here, Alfred, I know it.
What makes you so sure?
Faith, Alfred. Faith.
This is such a good character arc, as he went from realistically depressed to being blindly positive. This is the thing with depressive realism, because even though Bruce was rational to believe that Superman might turn bad, as he compared it to other guys going bad, he still has a very distorted view of the world. He's still blindly assuming that someone is gonna destroy the world, even though he has done nothing to prove that. So his hope also comes from seeing Superman be good and being disproven by reality once again. I believe this is something that we can heavily learn from, because for those of us who feel depressed or feel sad, we often have an idea that our depressed view, is the actual reality, and we operate out of logic. To some extent, this logic is valid. To a whole nother extent, it's not. I'm gonna give you a personal example which has to do with motivational surges. I think we can all relate to getting motivational surges or getting epiphanies. We all read motivational quotes, or we learn profound ideologies to fix our lives. Maybe you watch one of my videos and get inspired, but in general we just get a sense of hope from things. And this hope feels really good, especially when we've had suffering. But what happens with me, and I'm sure many others, is that after that motivational surge, I improve myself for a period of time. I improve my sleeping schedule. Things that felt bad to me are starting to feel better. And then after a while, I lose the consistency and I'm back to square one. And this goes with a lot of forms of improvement that I want to have. But if you have an accurate view of the world, you kind of realize that, well, every time I feel hope to improve or try to go in a positive direction, it doesn't really turn out well. So what's the point of anything new that I want to improve? Every time I felt hope to improve, I kinda subconsciously and consciously killed it in my head and said there's no reason to attach to that hope, it will lead to nothing anyway. This is why I resonate so much with Bruce's character. He also killed positive ideas with reason. But what did we learn? Just because there's some realism in our perception doesn't mean it's completely accurate. Because faith and hope is realistic as well. And I'm gonna continue my personal story with a funny example. I'm gonna tell you how toothpick is the proof for why faith and hope is realistic in my case. Because I mentioned that everything I want to improve doesn't go as planned, but that's not completely true. It felt like that in my head, but I used to have a goal that I wanted to clean my teeth every day and use a toothpick. I tried to be consistent with it so many times, but I started for 1 week, it went well, then I stopped. And the cycle just repeated. But a few months ago, I tried it again, and since then I've been doing it for every day. Probably because I got more vain, but whatever helps. And this made me realize that not every hope I have turns out to nothing. There are things where my hope does get rewarded, even though if it's just as small as a toothpick. I also have other examples which my distorted mind didn't want to admit to, but those things alone make it worthy to hope. So, if you're also cynical like this and you think that your cynicism is the actual truth, start to be critical of your perspective. Has everything you started always turned bad, or have there been periods where you were consistently studying or working out, or things were going well for you? Start to fixate on the positive aspects of your reality, or should I say the realistic aspects of your reality. Sounds a bit strange, but even if it's just as small as a toothpick in my case, allow yourself to hope for it. Thinking positive can be a tricky thing though, which is why I have another video linked that's also a deep dive on Batman, but on the Batman. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, drop me a like if you want. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon.